Pirate Kings, Pirate Queens, non-binary monarchs of the sea, happy release day. Time for us to start playing our tournaments with OP06 Wings of the Captain. I have spent this past week leading up to the release going over the top leaders in the format, according to data I gathered from the Eastern format, and I've compiled all of my thoughts from those videos right here, along with a broader tier list, an overview of how the format progressed over time in the East, and a few thoughts on how things could go on our side of the world. I hope you enjoy this video and find it useful because I have been prepping the spreadsheets since this set came out in Japan, and I've been so excited to share everything. If you do enjoy it, let me know by leaving a like, feel free to share any of your thoughts of your own in the comments, and if you want to support the channel so I can keep making more videos like this, I would be so grateful to see you subscribe. Getting into our new set, OP06 Wings of the Captain was released on November 24th, 2023 in Japan, and gives us 6 new leaders. Red-Purple Uta, Green-Hody Jones, Green-Black Perona, Green-Yellow Yamato, Blue-Purple Reiju, and Black Gecko Moria. The set includes new Red Film, Blue Navy, and Yellow Wano cards, and introduces the green New Fishman Pirates, Purple Germa Kingdom, and Black Thriller Bark archetypes. OP06 contains a lot of power creep across the board. Some colors get less than others, but the amount of advantage, offense, and combo potential some of these cards grant is just a big step up from what we've had in the past. 2 of these new leaders also have decks that revolve around resurrecting characters from the trash, and strategies utilizing a combo playstyle are becoming more and more common rather than being seen in just a select few decks. The OP06 metagame very much found itself reacting to the Tier 0 Sakazuki format from Set 5, with many players setting their hopes on new leaders that might be able to out-aggress or overwhelm Sakazuki's control. And this phenomenon, this reaction, this attitude was prevalent throughout the format as a whole, but we'll get more into the timeline itself after these deck profiles. A new starter deck, ST13 The Three Brothers, was also released a month after OP06 in Japan, and we'll be getting it a month into the Western OP06 format as well. For this video, I have included tournament data from the release of OP06 up until the release of EB01, which does include the period of time when ST13 was available and the most recent release at the time. And that's because the 3 Starter Deck 13 leaders never consistently broke into the top tiers at this time, and the new yellow cards included didn't find themselves in a lot of topping lists, or at least not often enough to make it into the list that we'll see here. But EB01, on the other hand, did introduce some very significant changes to the format, so I've decided to exclude it for now. But I do hope to cover EB01 specifically as we get closer to its own English release. In case you're a new viewer, here is a quick rundown of my process for these videos. I put every single deck list from One Piece top decks and second storage into a spreadsheet, weighted each entry according to the tournament's level of competition, the list's placement in that tournament, and how far into the format that tournament took place to come up with a point system that let me arrange the decks into tiers, as well as an algorithm to put together a typical winning deck list weighted to the conditions that I just mentioned. You'll also see helpful stats about a deck's cost curve, the amount of 2K counters, non-counters, blockers, events, and other relevant figures. So take a look and enjoy as we get into the best decks of OP06. Before we get into the full commentary on the top 7 decks of OP06, let's start our tier list off with some honorable mentions. As a reminder, here are the criteria for the point shares defining each leader's placement in these tiers, so let's get into it. Alright, we're going to start this off with the tier. Not like a kind of but like a you know, when you see something a little wacky on One Piece top decks, something that people were saying wasn't good, and you see it do on a turn, you're like, or that's pretty cool, You know, that's the kind of thing we're doing. Anything with less than 1% of the points. Normally, I would drag and drop these in real time, but for some reason, tier maker's being a little difficult with me. We've got Blue, Yellow, Ace. I am including the Star Deck 13 leaders in here just to show where they ended up since their tournament data was part of this, even though we won't have them for another month. We got Purple Luffy. He fell very far from Set 5. It's just too much for him to deal with here. Bello Betty, Zoro, these heavy aggro decks just aren't really doing it as much. We have Zephyr, we have Hody Jones. Took him a while, but he got something at the very least. Queen, one of my favorite decks. I know, flame me in the comments. I really want to try that 9-cost Sanji in there. That's going to be so fun. Arlong, Trigger for Days. King, Inverse Zoro. I honestly love seeing him, at least on the bottom of the tier list. I like seeing him actually in the tier list. Grapple Dofi, the Zoro Sanji from Star Deck 12 that comes out for us the same day as Set 6. It's kind of gimmicky, but it's neat. And then we have Blue Doflamingo, which makes sense because we basically get Black Doflamingo in this set. But I do hope we get to see more of him in Set 7 with some of the leaks they've got. But that's a couple videos away. Then in the Rogue tier, the decks that have a bit of punch to them, something that, a decent pilot can win some tournaments with, but something you're not expecting to make up a significant portion of a Treasure Cup or a regional, at least not all the time. And not something you're usually anticipating when you're testing for these things, at least not as a priority. Nami's at top of Rogue. I like White Snake. That card is a little silly. That card does give her a little more fast, so she's closing out games a little quicker when she's able to. The Black Yellow Luffy. This is probably the one that we're gonna see this do some things on our side of the field, especially once we get EBO1. But for now, he's in Rogue tier. Edward Newgate. People say the Sakazuki matchup's good, but I don't think it's that good or good enough to really save him from being very much fringe at this point. Red Purple Law, I love this deck. It's just not quite there yet, but he will be getting some new pieces soon. Red Yellow Sabo, I haven't even looked too much into these lists, but he seems actually surprisingly versatile. And the Green Uta, she was doing decently in that second half of Set 5 until Sakazuki came around, and, she still has that barrier. A lot of these decks are also just oppressed out of the format by the top tiers, rather than just being inherently weak. But what you see below is what we have to work with, so let's get into Tier 3 and beyond. We're going to start this off with one of my favorite decks in the format, one that I am a bit sad to be putting all the way down at number 7 in Tier 3, Reiju. This is really the only placement that I just feel a bit weird about. I don't think she's in the top 3 by any means, but the potential that she has to just pop off with a good pilot feels really reminiscent of Law, and I thought she'd be higher. She did really, really well in the first half of the format up until Star Deck 13 came out, but after that she started to dip and just really wasn't doing nearly as much. I will say that the difference between her and the number 6 deck is so minor. As far as the number of points they got, within a hair, and the number 6 deck just got their points a little bit later. So the way we weigh things out, Reiju had to be at the bottom, someone had to, but she's still a wonderful deck. Like I alluded to, she feels like a spiritual successor to Law. Lots of combo power, she cheats characters out, lots of resource generation, and requires a really skilled pilot to do well with the deck at all. Reiju's ability is that once per turn during your turn, when one of your Don cards on the field is returned to the Don deck, you draw one card. So this ability is going to be giving you advantage pretty much every turn, and your main strategy is going to cheat these Germa 66 characters out from your hand or usually from your trash. You're definitely going to be spending a good part of the game searching out the pieces for your combos, with potential for this amazingly huge judge combo that we'll get into in a bit, but that's not the deck's only goal. In addition to making this big checkmate play with a 5-character board as well as your leader, you can also try to rush your opponent down or play a resource game by drawing more and more cards every turn and reusing these bodies to just poke at your opponent. We've got 10 2K counters in this list, but some lists are running as many as 14, so feel free to add more. Kaya not only draws us cards, but she also lets us get those Germa 66 characters into the discard in order to facilitate the combos we're going to do. Vinsmoke Sora is mostly going to be a searchable 2K, but there could be a situation where her ability to replace herself with a 4,000 power or less Germa 66 from your trash could end up getting you that last rusher you need to close out the game. But not very often, she's mostly just a 2K. Same thing goes for Miss Doublefinger. She could ramp a Doan, and she could discard an evolved Germa 66, but that's not anywhere close to your preferred play in this deck. Normally, I arrange the entire list according to cost when I go through these, but I'm going to group all the Vinsmoke siblings with both of their cards, the little version and the bigger version. The 2-cost Reiju can be played turn 1 going second, and she is the reason that this deck can have so much longevity in games. Doan -1, you draw 1 from the leader through her effect, and then you play the 4-cost Reiju, which says on play, if you have equal to or less Doan than your opponent, which you will if you're playing her this early, and 5 or less cards in your hand, you can then draw 2 more cards. So you'll be going from 6 cards to 5, down to 4, then back up to 7 actually. She is a 5k swing that doesn't take cards from your hand. She's actually a +1. She's a pot of greed that can swing. And as long as you have another 2-cost Reiju ready to go, you don't even care if your opponent swings into her. You can just bring her back as soon as you play the next 2-cost Reiju. So you don't even really have to save counter for her. You can use that for your life. Because if you're going the judge route, you want to make sure that you're around 3 when the judge hits. This 2-2 line of Yonji is going to be the most contentious pick here, with a lot of division among Japanese players on whether to even include him in the first place. After the transformation, he becomes a 4-cost 6k blocker as long as you are equal to or lower on Don, and that's not a bad stat line at all. But this format just has a lot of ways to make the fact that he's a blocker irrelevant. Green has Izo, yellow has Amaru, they can KO him with Impact, Moria has Great Eruption and Absalom, Sakazuki has so many ways to get rid of a 4-cost blocker, so he's not gonna get the use of his effect nearly as often as you would like. This is basically the same issue that chump blockers had back in OP02, but they still did see some play because the Don used to KO them could make the difference between lethal or not, even if the blocker isn't explicitly doing so. In my eyes, the reason to play Yonji is because it's another 4-cost body that you can cheat out at 2 Don, in case you don't see the Reiju combo, and because it's another body for pressure at the end of the game off of a judge play. It's more bodies that a control deck has to try and KO, and in the mirror match, it's more aggression that you have, so having the extra character is just going to come in handy. But again, your own mileage may vary. He is cuttable. I think that depending on matchups, you might not need to play this line. You could put more 2k counters in, or a couple of other options. Niji transforms into a 5-cost 6k that can either bounce a 4 or less or KO a 2 or less on play. Removal is going to be one of the least evident facets of this toolboxy deck, but there is some in the form of Niji. Really like using him against Kikunojo in yellow or Borsellino against any black matchup. You can also hard play him when you're at 5 Don, and the bounce effect is pretty strong even at full cost. You don't necessarily want to Don minus every turn anyway, because then your judge just gets further and further away, so the 5-cost Niji is a great option to just hard play from hand, get a body on the board, break up your opponent's tempo, and still be able to get to those bigger plays you want to in a relatively timely manner. Ichiji is a 4-cost 4k, and he is going to be the main attacker of this deck. He starts out as a 4-cost 4k, so 1 Don would make him an attacker. If you stick him out the turn before you transform him, you can get a 5k swing in and then transform him to become a 7-cost 7k that on play will be able to reduce something's power by 2,000, soften up bodies if you're trying to go for the control game, or you can soften up a Borsellino even if you don't attack it. That way your 5k swing with your leader is still gonna do something. Early 7k swings off life are great. If you've ever played versus Katakuri, which I'm sure you have, you definitely know that. Keep in mind that the big Germa cards can come from the hand, so you might not be able to predict if your opponent has one if they're playing Reiju just based on their discard alone. If you're against Reiju, pay very close attention to what they search and whether they have an Ichiji, just to make sure they don't surprise lethal you. And since the 7-cost Ichiji is the only Vinsmoke sibling that doesn't have counter, he's an easy pick for your discard off of things like Germa Kingdom if you already have the combo pieces you need in there at that moment. Before we get to our boss card and our engine, we do have a couple utility cards I want to touch on. If this deck didn't already feel like a Pokemon deck enough, with all the drawing it does and what's basically evolution, Pudding is our version of N. On play, your opponent has to shuffle their entire hand back into their deck and then draw 5 cards. This is huge against decks that are either going to have a ton of cards in hand, like Newgate, or do a lot of drawing or searching, such as Sakazuki. This is easily a value move if your opponent has 7 or more cards in hand, but if they kept their hand without mulliganing it, or they got something good off of a searcher, the case can be made to drop her when your opponent is at 6 cards in hand, or maybe even at 5 if you know it's going to be a critical movement. This card's very devastating when she is timed well, and if you're in a situation where you know that your opponent's just going to kill you on the crackback, and you've got a couple bodies, you're not sure if you're going to be able to get the lethal there, there's a chance you can just play the luck game, slap her down, and see if you can get rid of their counter. Just a Hail Mary play, but I'll let you decide if that's worth trying in the moment. We've got 2 Queen in this list, though he wasn't super popular. That's good news if you're playing Reiju for budget reasons, since most of these cards are from set 6, but it was included in a couple of the higher achieving lists, so the algorithm did keep him in the final list that we're presenting here. He's a 5-cost 6k blocker, he gets you draws, he discards to set up your combos, he is a Don't Minus for your leader ability, and he's not affected by certain removals such as Ezo or, more often, 200 million volts Amaru. Impact is still going to hit him. Your mileage may vary on this one. I still have my Star Deck 4 cards. I'm going to try it with him, but he's another potential cut if you're looking to make room for something else. Then we have Vinsmoke Judge, the boss card of the deck. Usually you're going to be hitting 8 Don on turn 5, maybe turn 6. You're only going to play 1 copy of Judge in a game, so there's no use running a full set with all this draw we have. He's also a non-counter, so you don't want to clog up on those. But we are playing him at 2 copies just so we have decent odds of seeing him. When he hits the field, you can Don -1, trash 2 cards from your hand, and then play up to 4 Germa 66 type characters with 4,000 power or less from your trash, as long as they all have different names. Once per turn, you can also Don -1 to rest an opponent's Don card. Not going to be the biggest thing, but maybe if you're against Newgate, I guess. That's not the reason this card is so good. He gets you 4 bodies. Playing out all of the Germa 66 kids is a massive turn. That's an 8 cost for Judge, a 4 cost, a 4 cost, a 5 cost, and a 7 cost. 28 cost total, 24 if you're playing without Yonji, but still, that's a lot for a control deck to have to get through. That's 33k in total, power-wise. The majority of the time, you'll be threatening lethal on your opponent, but there will also be a lot of times when he is not the answer. If you already have a board, you might be able to make more efficient or impactful plays that wouldn't require you to nuke the characters you already have. Judge is best used to rebuild your board. This also lends a bit of expendability to our characters, so keep that in mind if you're planning to play him during a game. If you're able to outgrind your opponent or rush them down without having to go for the Judge play, keep going in that direction. He is just one way to win with the deck, not the only way. Also, trashing 2 cards might seem like a disadvantage most of the time, but those 4 characters that you get out with him can literally be the ones you trash. So this combo is easier to get the pieces for than you might think with this deck. Germa 66 is our 1 cost search event. The trigger is to draw a card, not to activate the main effect, which is unfortunate, but it's still a great play turn 1. It'll start getting you the cards you need, but it's not nearly as good as Germa Kingdom. 1 cost stage, activate main. You can trash 1 card from your hand, rest the stage, and then take a Germa 66 card from the top 3 of your deck. This is the usual mulligan target, unless you don't have any turn 2 combo possible, or if you have a guaranteed Reiju or Ichiji combo. Mainly Reiju for advantage, Ichiji if the rest of the hand gets you going. You could even play 2 copies of this card, turn 1 going second if you don't start the Reiju combo, just so you can keep your foot on the gas, get this extra card out of your hand, get more searches, see your pieces as soon as possible. Before we finish up, here are some stats as far as how often each of the cards we'll see in the deck were included, and how often they're included at different counts as well. And here are the other cards that I saw included in Reiju at different counts, and definitely less often. The 5-cost Suru from set 6 is a 2k counter. On play, you can trash 2 from your hand, get pieces in the discard, and then make your opponent return one of their characters to their own hand. Decent tempo play. Jambar is another ramper, lets you swing for 5. Blackbug is basically a 3,000 worlds for Germa Kingdom specifically. As long as you have equal to or less Don than your opponent, you can bottom deck a 5 cost, and the trigger lets you bottom deck a 4 cost. Decent removal, but that's just not the direction that most of these Reiju decks decided to go in. If you want to add a counter event that also mills and sets up your combos, you can try Gum Gum Giant Gavel. Khalifa's a Dome -1, 2k counter, draw 2, discard 1. Cosette is another German 66 card. She is a chump blocker as long as you have 2 or more less Dome than the opponent, and if you have a German 66 leader, not included very often. No idea when we're getting this promo Yamato to mulligan your hand. Gion is specifically a Nami tech, another blue 2k counter that swings for 5. When your opponent activates an event, your opponent places 1 card from their hand at the bottom of the deck. At least I saw that it was a Nami tech according to one article I read. Probably helps against Sakazuki as well, if they don't just bottom deck her first. Deathwink is another counter event, but I don't see when you would have the free Dome to play this if you're trying to expand your board. And Red Rock can bottom deck anything. Same thing with Deathwink. I think you would rather just devote your Dome to getting characters out. And then Blast Breath is another very efficient 4k counter event, but I think Gum Gum Giant Gavel is going to be a bit better. This is one of the more fun decks in the set. It's got a very high ceiling, multiple directions you can go in. I feel like even though you have the same bag of tricks, every game is going to be a little different. If you enjoy learning a deck and seeing yourself get better and better the more you play with it, then this is a great pick. Also a great budget pick. Again, don't worry about Queen. Not mandatory. Most of these cards are from set 6. Prices are going to go down from pre-release right now. This will be a very, very affordable pick. You're only going to want to Dome minus once per turn in most cases in order to get the max use out of your leader ability. Probably going to have 1 or 2 turns without even using a Dome minus just to make sure you get to 7 Dome on turn 6. You've got lots of potential plays there. Hopefully 8 Dome if you're going in the Judge direction. Since you're going to be Dome minusing a lot of turns, there's not a standard 1, 3, 5, 7, 9 or 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 sort of curve with this deck. There are a couple of prevalent patterns that this deck might go through. I'm going to put those up on the screen right here. Again, notice that you're not transforming every turn. Sometimes you're playing that Niji straight from your hand in order to be able to use your Judge by turn 6 at the latest. Like I mentioned at the start, this is going to be one of the few cases where I am not on the same page as the rankings my algorithm has spit out. I believe that if you really, really put the time in with this deck, learn all the subtleties, learn every single matchup, you can stand a chance against any of the decks in the format. At least the ones we're going to be talking about here. All the good ones, at the very least. I think Reiju can go pretty far in a tournament. We're probably going to see her topping a few things. I'd love to see her win something. I'm a Reiju believer. I hope that my explanation has done something to help make you a believer as well. Go, go, Power Rangers! And let's move on to number 6. Coming in at number 6, we have a very fun deck from this new set, and probably one of my pet decks for the format, Perona. It took some time for her to see traction. She didn't really pop up in the format until just before Star Deck 13 came out. Being a black deck and a green deck, she's got some control capabilities, but not full-on control like Sakazuki per se. I like calling her a stun, delay, tempo-ish deck with some stall and starve capabilities as well. Perona has 2 abilities, and Bandai made the healthy decision to only let a player choose 1 to use each turn. She can either rest up to one opponent's character that costs 4 or less, or give one opponent's character -1 cost for the turn. This is incredibly versatile. The -1 cost is great in the early and mid game to clean up board state, get those tempo plays going, and the rest ability is great at the end to get past blockers or to set up stun plays with Doflamingo. And if you don't need to use the leader's reduction early on, you can just rest whatever your opponent has on the board, be that a small character to attack into, or a blocker like Borsalino. Suru is an obligatory inclusion in a black deck. Again, this isn't a full-on control deck, but Suru gives us an efficient option to swing certain situations. For example, a 5-cost blocker, or any 5-cost character that you wouldn't be able to rest using the leader ability on its own. We've got 2 different searchers in this deck. Even though Perona is a Thriller Bark type leader, that's not the predominant character type in this deck. We are running Don Quixote and Navy characters in here. Baby 5 is a Jewelry Bonnie for Don Quixote Pirates. You can play her for 1, rest her, and then look at the top 5 to get any Don Quixote Pirate card from the top 5 of your deck. So she's going to get some of the big power cards in here, especially our 10-cost Doflamingo. but she's also going to stave off our opponent's early attacks on life because they're not going to want us to get resources. And this works out really well because in this deck particularly, we're not trying to get too low on life early. We want to maintain a healthy total until we're in the late game. You're going to be seeing a lot of brand new in this video series as well. He fetches our Navy cards. On play, look at the top 3 from your deck, reveal 1 Navy, add it to hand, then discard the other 2. You'll see we have quite a few Navy cards in here, usually from 17 to 20 in the deck. He's great for consistency. You can rest a small character, 1-cost searcher, maybe a chump blocker, and attack into them with brand new instead of your leader, so your leader is then free to swing life. He's also going to fuel the discard for our 8-cost Gecko Moria. We'll get into him soon because, oh boy, that's a card. Some lists were also playing the Inupe from set 6, draw 2, trash 2, on play or KO, specifically if you have Thriller Bark in your leader type, but he wasn't prevalent enough to make it into this 50. Don Quixote Rocinante is a 2-cost, 1,000 power chump blocker, very cheap to play, but he is best used near the end of the game. And that's because he also has the ability to act as a substitute when one of your other rested characters would be KO, whether that's by battle or by effect. And even though he can only block when he's active, this effect can be used whether he is active or rested, which is probably going to happen quite a bit since he can be resurrected by Gecko Moria. As an example, let's say that your opponent wants to clear the Borsellino blocker you have. They can't KO by effects. If they're not running blue, they're not going to be able to tuck it. So the only way that they could get around it is by attacking into it. If you have Rocinante on the field as well, they're going to have to swing into that Borsellino twice if they want to remove it. Rocinante is also seen by both Baby 5 and Branu because he is Navy and Don Quixote Pirates, so he's an incredibly consistent card. Tashigi's mainly going to be another couple 2k counters, but she could come in clutch if you're facing up against Reiju, since she lets you get an easier KO on an early 7-cost Ichiji. If you play her down turn 2 going first, and then the Reiju player decides to go for a rush Ichiji play on their second turn, you're going to come back to your turn, you'll have 5 down, and they'll have a rested 7-cost. Perona brings it down to 6, and then you could potentially play a Suru to bring it down to 4, and then use Ryuma, which we'll talk about in a second, to KO it since it will be at 4-cost. But if you're missing the Suru, or you have DS Drake in hand instead of Ryuma, you can bring it down to 4 with Tashigi, and then you'll have a much easier time KOing it. That's just one example. I can see her being useful against yellow at times as well. She wasn't really played much in these earlier parts of Perona's success. These slots used to be the 3rd and 4th copies of Kuzan. Adding a character without any counter can be a little difficult in this deck, but the fact that he replaces himself does help with that, and being able to reduce something's cost by 4 sets up some really, really big plays. This isn't limited to KOing an 8-cost or a 9-cost if it's already rested through your Ryuma or Drake, plus maybe the leader ability, but you can also rest an 8-cost and then either attack into it or lock it with your 10-cost Doflamingo. Japanese players were a bit split on how many counts to play of Kuzan. Like I mentioned before, there was a pretty noticeable shift from 4 as the norm down to 2, but he's really helpful if you play him at the right time, especially off Gecko Moria. 4-cost Borsellino is just the ultimate staple card for a black deck. This dude's been $30 plus since December. Protection against control decks is great in this meta, and taxing a dome for your opponent's attacks is just great across the board in a deck that's trying to stall out like this one is. Now we're going to get into our big tempo cards with the Sword God Ryuma. He was literally made for this deck in particular. He has vanilla stats, and he KOs a rested 4-cost on play or on KO. So you get tempo, you get to start processing your opponent's board, and they are discouraged from returning that, unless they're blue. He's got no counter, but he's our go-to play turn 3 or turn 2 going second. And he's 4-cost, so Moria can revive him and you can do it over and over and over again. The only real downside is that he's not searchable by Branu or Baby 5, so just keep that in mind as you draw your opening hand. He's probably going to be one of your main mulligan targets. DS Drake is very similar. He's basically our 5th through 8th copies of backup Ryuma. He's a 5-cost, so you're only going to be able to play him from turn 3 and onward, and he can't be revived by Moria for that reason, but he is searchable by Branu, and he's got a 1k counter to make up for that, plus he's going to take a little more effort to remove since he's a 5-cost. Sabo also sees a big uptick in play during set 6. He's going to give us protection to any KO effects, so we can keep the tempo that we start to establish, and the cycling is going to get us closer to the cards that we need, and especially the ones that we can't search, like Ryuma, and especially Gecko Moria.
Virgo's just going to be a 2K. He's not something you're really looking to play onto the board. But the perk is that he is a dual searchable target, just like Rocinante, Navy, and Doflamingo Pirates in one card. From here we get into our top end, starting with the new best card in black. In my opinion, the best card in set 6, Gecko Moria. He's an 8-cost 9K, and he has the overpowered ability to, on play, resurrect a 4-cost and a 2-cost from your trash, 1 rested and 1 active. That's 14 Dawn of Bodies for 8. Insane. And there are so many directions you can take the choices you make with him. If you want to establish defense, you get Borsellino and Rocinante. If you want to get a KO effect off, you go Suru and Ryuma. If you need hand advantage, you get Kuzan and Brand-New, and then you can also set up for a big Dofi play on your next turn. And 9K body is no slouch. I love getting 3 cards out of my opponent's hand when I attack their leader. This card's overtuned. I don't know what they were thinking. And our big boss is the 10-cost Don Quixote do Flamingo from set 4. In the early and mid game, you're going to be focusing on tempo, getting rid of your opponent's bodies, making sure that they can't throw a bunch of offense your way. But at a certain point, you stop focusing on that, and you start shifting to stunning the bodies that your opponent has, so they have no chance of lethaling you, and then overwhelming them with the pressure that you just keep on building turn after turn. He is our ideal search target off of Baby 5. You're always going to want to see multiple Doflamingos over the course of a game. The winner, oh my god, they made this card seem so long. Whoever wins this war becomes justice is a 0-cost event that lets us discard a card from our hand and give someone an extra 3k power. Basically, it's a 2k counter, and you are turning one of your cards into a 1k. This will really come in handy to make sure we don't get clogged up with all of these non-counter cards we're running, but the trigger to rest an opponent's character with a cost of 4 or less also sets up our Ryuma, our DS Drake, and our Doflamingo plays as the game goes on. Here are the inclusion and card count stats for the cards in the algorithm list. You'll see that a lot of these were played in every single deck, and most of the other ones were played in at least 70%. Tashigi is really the only straggler, and that's just because she was a later inclusion in the list. And even though the shell was pretty much set in stone once Perona started taking tops, there was some innovation there. Baby 5 could be another searchable 2k counter if you feel like you don't have enough of those. Inupe, I briefly mentioned him. On play or on KO, you can draw 2, trash 2. Great for cycling. Brook is a 6-cost 6k. He's a nice tech if you really don't want to deal with sticky bodies, if you don't want to deal with your opponent saboing their own board against black. On play, you can either put one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 4 into the trash. You're not KOing it, so immunity doesn't work. You can get rid of a Borsellino like this. Or you can make your opponent put 3 cards from their trash to the bottom of their deck in any order. Useful against something like Moria if they're running low on discard resources and you don't want them to Absalom or Lucci you into oblivion. Ice Age is the most efficient cost reduction that black has. 1 Doan for -5 is incredibly powerful. If you're not feeling Kuzan, maybe you want to try this, but the deck has enough, and at a certain point, you're not really worried about KOing, you're just trying to keep the tempo up. Ironically, the Perona character from set 6 barely saw any play. On play, you can rip a card from your opponent's hand, or reduce the cost of a character by 3 if your opponent has 5 cards in hand. She's a 2k. She's also not searchable though, so she's not great for the consistency here. And then everything else I think was just played in a singular list. The 2-cost Rocinante Chump Blocker, searchable. Sugar can automatically get a rest if you're trying to go for the Dofi play. Killer's pretty cool actually. On play, KO arrest a character with 3 or less. I'm not sure how relevant that number is here, but I like the idea. Viola is another searchable 2k. DS Drake can buff up your Navy characters if you find yourself attacking with them a lot. Arlong can stop an opponent's leader from attacking. Someone decided to try playing 2 copies of the 8-cost kit here. I think that's a viable option, but I don't think that's the best place for him in this format. We'll get into that over the course of the week. And then Great Eruption. Someone played 1 copy for an extra -2. I'm still not even sure you need it. There is so much consistency in this deck. There's so much advantage in this deck, and again, you have ways to reduce cost. Maybe you would have. Feel free to try it out. The general curve of this deck isn't anything too complicated. Early game, you're going to play your Searchers, your Baby 5s, and your Brand News. Maybe a Tashigi if you think you might need the extra reduction on board. Mid game, you're going to be KOing things with Drake or Ryuma. Maybe setting up a Sabo to give your board some security. And then you just spam Moria and Doflamingo until you have ground your opponent out of resources, then go in for lethal. This might just be me, but Perona's a pretty fun deck. And I did not expect I'd be saying that. I did not think I'd enjoy it nearly as much as I do. It's a good resource grind / go tall deck, and the concept as a whole is pretty linear. Again, the curve isn't that difficult to follow, but there are some pretty central pivot points that do reward good forethought, and I suggest everyone try this out. If you have a decent collection of cards from sets 1 through 5, then the only real inclusions you're going to need here are the Ryuma and the Moria. Depends what your budget is. For Moria, I think that card's just going to be very important to have, especially since Japan didn't ban him. We'll see if things change in the West. At some point, getting a playset. Number 5 is a leader that made a lot of waves when he came out in OP05. Whether you worship him or scorn him, he is still on the board for OP06. And now, like I mentioned in the Perona video, I maintain that Moria is the best individual card in set 6. But as far as the sheer number of really good, generically splashable cards for one color, Yellow got the best of the haul. This leads to a lot of room for diversity in deck building for Yellow, especially for NL. In set 5, you could go for a Sky Island build for a more offensive approach, and Big Mom if you want to go on defense. Set 6 cards are going to give both avenues more juice, but a lot of the lists that I found were hybrids. Between the Big Mom, Sky Island, and Wano types, most decks had 15 or less of each of those 3 card types. The list shown here is sort of a greatest hits from the algorithm, and I've really enjoyed it as a starting point so far, but I will say that there is plenty of room to build off of this and make it your own. The deck's general strategy is going to stay the same as it was in set 5. Take the early hits on life, build a big hand, hopefully see some characters from Trigger, get yourself down to 1, then keep on regenerating with Katakuri, Yamato, build a bunch of tall characters, and then make sure your opponent has less than 3 attacks on the board, or make sure that you can counter out of a third if you have to make sure that they cannot lethal you, and then keep on grinding until you know you have to go for game. Kozuki Hiyori is a 2-cost, 0-power 2K that lets annoy NL players the way that he knows best, stacking triggers. On play, you can put the top or bottom card of your life into your hand, and then put any one card from your hand on the top of your life pile. If you go second and you see her and Shirahoshi in your opening hand, you put a draw 3 discard 2 right on the top there. If you have a Maru or Beige in hand with her when you get to 1 life, cool, your opponent's going to start seething. You do have to keep in mind that you're giving up a 2k when you play her, and then your opponent might choose to focus on the board instead of your life. But if you're in a place where that's going to be what's best for you, it could be a fun mind game. Onami's gained a lot of notoriety for anyone who's looked into set 6 with her ability to give someone banish on play. But that's not the main factor here. She's more so played because she is a Thunderbolt with counter. Exact same trigger ability. That being said, the banish could be pretty good if you expect that your opponent's going to give up the cards to get around it. You've probably noticed that we do not run any Searchers in this build, and Searchers were pretty rare for NL and OP06. There was one list that ran Shura, and no one had Pudding. But power cards like Yamato and 8-cost Katakuri are key to this deck. Plus, card advantage is exactly how NL manages to play the long game, so Sanji, the 2k from set 3, can now use some advantage, especially if you're in a game when you really need to dig for your play on 4 or 5 Don't. Little fringe, but very useful. Otherwise, he's still a 2k. There's not really much I need to say about Beige. Still the best yellow trigger we'll have. Always play him at 4 in this deck, especially when you're trying to manage the number of attacks that your opponent has. We've got 2 Brûlé, free trigger blocker. The set 4 Sanji saw less play in set 6 than he had before, potentially because of the discard, but getting a free blocker without having to lose any cards can literally be the difference between winning and losing, so 2 copies is a pretty safe play here. Kikunojo is the new staple yellow character. There are some naysayers because she doesn't have any counter, and her effect to heal when she's KO'd is going to be contingent on the opponent having 3 life or less, but she saw a lot of success in Japan. Some players went as far as to call her the Yellow Magellan, since they are that hesitant to KO her. Sakazuki can tuck her, but at least you're forcing them to use that kind of removal. And the threat she poses makes her work well with Gadatsu. When you attack your opponent and threaten to put them down to 3 life, they have to choose which effect they want you to have active. Either they counter it, and Gidatsu can KO the character they're going to play, or Kikunoja comes in and just lets Enel stall even more. Forcing a tough decision is great in a deck that loves the long game like Enel does. Just make sure you really think it through and you have the pieces to commit if you're going to be playing these kind of games with your opponent. Against controlled matchups like Black or life races like Katakuri, trigger characters are going to make a world of difference. So Satori is still a popular inclusion since he's got a relatively high cost and he's a 2k counter to boot. Some of the higher achieving lists also played 3 or 4 Cracker, so he's also worth considering, especially if you expect a lot of yellow in your local meta. Gidatsu's even more useful than he was before, with Moria, a 5-life leader, doing well, and Purple Luffy falling out of favor. Spoilers for the rest of these videos. He can KO any character resurrected by Gecko Moria's leader ability, even if you've taken a life from them, and he is still one of our best outs to Kuzan, which is a card that Yellow hates leaving on the board. Also pretty helpful in the Perona matchup. Shirahoshi's still useful to filter, especially since, again, we don't play a Searcher and so many non-counter cards. Paying 5 and playing her on turn 3 is legitimately a viable move in Enel. This next one came as a bit of a surprise to me. The 4 copies of 7-cost Linlin. She was super popular in the Asian format, but you really need to make sure you use her well if you're playing her at 4 copies like all these players did. She's great on turn 4. She's almost mandatory on turn 4. But after that she can be a little bit precarious since this deck mainly operates at 1 life. If you can maintain a game state where your opponent won't be able to lethal you at 1 life, she's amazing. But if your opponent gets too aggressive, if they keep too many bodies on the board, if you try and bluff and they see through it, they'll just burn one of their own life and then lethal you on their turn. That being said, 80% of these lists were playing her either at 3 or 4, so I really can't argue with that math. In addition, the leader effect, Shirahoshi, and some of these triggers do give us ways to discard the extra copies, so that makes it an easy choice. 8-cost Katakuri is just as versatile as ever. Putting Shirahoshi back into life is a very standard play, and Onami and Okiku, especially after Okiku's already attacked, they're not too shabby to add either. Plus, keeping the number of attacks your opponent has equal to your life plus 2 is the name of the game, so he can stave them off. Especially if you're facing down that 8-cost Moria. Really want to get him off the board. And then you can set up a cheeky Gidatsu or a Yamato. Start your turn at 1 life, slap him down for 9 Don, hopefully KO something, regenerate an extra life, then you're back at 2, next turn you go back to 1, you do it all over again, you rinse and repeat. Just like in set 5, he is the star of the deck, and most hands with him are going to be keepers. Always want to see a couple copies of him over the course of the game. 200 Villian Molts. 200 Villian Molts. Can you hear my voice getting tired yet? 200 million volts Amaru proved its usefulness versus Sakazuki in set 5, and the same applies for the new matchups like Moria. Plus, it's going to come in handy for board control or for increasing our odds of getting lethal. People are more aware of it now than they were back in set 5, so there's a good chance they'll try and leave you at 2 life to stop it from wrestling their blocker. But you can now counter-circumvent that with Reject, a cracked new card from set 6, which we might, potentially, maybe, we'll probably get to play with it. It really depends on if and when we get this new ban list that Japan just adopted. This card is too good, and it has 2 effects. First off, it can KO a 5-cost for 4 Don. That's Thunderbolt without having to burn a life, or Yellow Jet Pistol. The only targets that Jet Pistol hits that it doesn't are the 6-cost Red Sanji, 6-cost Black Brook, and then a few other, honestly, irrelevant cards that I will be very surprised to see at a tournament, but kind of stoked to at the same time. But on top of that, if your opponent is at 1 life, you can add one of your life to hand, rather than trashing it like with Thunderbolt, and then deal that last damage to your opponent. So you're not just reducing the number of attacks that you need to close out the game, but this can set up your Amaru plays just like Thunderbolt did last format, but in a more versatilely, if that's a word, aggressive fashion. This card's getting banned for a reason. This card was a mistake. But if we can use it for any amount of time, which I think we will, we probably got at least a couple weeks, you might as well try it out. Here are the inclusion and card count stats for the cards we have in our data list. You'll see that Sanji, Brule, and Satri were played most often at 4 instead of the 2 counts we've gotten here. But since the algorithm only works with 50 cards and prioritizes achievement as well as popularity, those came down. But those are some of the first ideas on cards to add to the deck. And then we get into the next most popular cards from set 6. In the Reiju and Perona videos, I was showing literally every other card that got played. This is the point where some just aren't going to get mentioned here because they're so fringe. Kosuke Momonosuke combos very well with Hiyori. He's a 5-cost 6k blocker, great stat line. On play, you can take one of your Land of Wano characters, put it face up in life. So you go Hiyori, exchange hand with a trigger, play Momonosuke, put the Hiyori back in life. Wonderful combo, just a little bit win more in this deck and not always the most consistent. Rush and Nell is a very durable body, good into Sakazuki, an alternative if you don't want to play a full 4 Big Mom, but not nearly as popular as her. I like Cracker a lot as a card. I think that this is a pretty good format for him, especially since we've got Moria with 5 life and Yellow Mirrors. He's always good in those. People were still playing Thunderbolt. This might have mainly been the earlier parts of the format before they read Reject and realized how insane it was. It just seems obsolete for me. You've got the main part in Reject, the trigger and Nami. I don't see any reason to prioritize having both on one card. You're the One Who Should Disappear, a 0-cost 3k counter event. Definitely fits with the Nell's MO, especially since we're playing these tall characters. Won't have a lot of open dome. But there are other ways to defend ourselves. The trigger is a free heal, and that is wonderful, but you're only going to see it so often. I'd rather have the Amaru trigger. Noikabra Arrow, another 1-cost defensive event. Ohm Holy combo, very popular in set 5, but ironically, Enel is no longer the home of the full Sky Island package. These new cards just mesh too well with the leader. 4-cost Sanji blocker, comes out on trigger, helps with durability. Pitching a card doesn't feel as good to me though. Elthor, I feel similar to that as I do with You're the One Who Should Disappear and Noikabra Arrow. Feels like we don't necessarily need it. Then we've got a card from Star Deck 13, which we will not have on set 6 release. Porcus D Ace. On play, if you have 2 or less life, he becomes a 5-cost 7k rusher. If there's a deck he's going to be live in, it's this one, but he was still pretty rare compared to the other stuff, even when you just consider the part of the meta that had Star Deck 13 available. Then we've got Shura over there playing his Cat's Cradle. Deck doesn't use Skyline as a searcher right now. If you want to build it that way, go for it, just didn't seem to be the way in Asia. Throughout the Set 6 Star Deck 13 format, Enel floated pretty consistently in Tier 2. I still think he's a functional deck. I still enjoy playing him. Sorry, I'm a degenerate that way. And these new yellow cards really do supplement him. But he doesn't take any overwhelmingly positive matchups against the new decks, and there's some games that are just going to be an uphill battle for him. I definitely think he belongs above Perona in these rankings. If I weren't going off the data, if I were just going off of my own impressions, my own experiences with these decks, I would be putting Reiju in this spot with Enel and Perona right under her. But I'm going to be objective here. Enel is in the number 5 spot. Maybe I'm just not good enough at playing with him. Maybe I just can't count to 3. Who knows? But if you enjoyed playing the deck in Set 5, if you have become a good pilot with the Thunder God, go for it. Keep him coming. Regardless of my own ideas, it has been shown that he can do well. He's just not going to be one of the main picks like he was last format. At number 4, we have the most anticipated new leader of Set 6, Yamato. So throughout the format, Yamato did well, but he wasn't the top deck that would break the meta like a fair amount of people expected. Native double attack is extremely powerful. It's very common to see him just swing 8k turn 2 and demand 2ks from the opponent immediately. At the same time, double attack also means that your opponent is going to get 2 extra cards, so they may be down to let it through, especially if they're a 5-life leader. But at that point, they need to be very careful not to let the second one in. And furthermore, just 1 double attack is going to turn on Yamato's second ability to reattach 2 Rested Dawn to a character and put even more pressure on the opponent. Even if the double attack doesn't hit, this is going to do a very good job of thinning your opponent's resources as you build your own board and keep hitting them for more and more and more. Yamato has tons of deck building diversity. We've got the Wano build, very aggressive, not the easiest time against control. Sky Island, just play bodies on bodies on bodies. The Fishman build to search out Hody Jones and do some other resting shenanigans. Some good stuff hybrids, and Fortress Yamato. Those first 4 types are all spiritually in tune with each other. Fortress is very much its own beast, so I've separated Fortress from the rest of the data as we look through this. And even though the Wano build was the most commonly reported winning build, Taking achievement into account with the algorithm leads us to a Wano Sky Island hybrid version. This data list is a little teched out, coupled two of some places where you can easily adjust ratios. I feel like those are pretty evident here. Onami is going to shine in this deck more than any other. Her trigger to KO a 5 cost is still plenty useful, but this is where the banish really comes into play. When you swing with a banish Yamato for 8k, your opponent has to make the decision to either lose 2 cards in their hand or 2 cards in their life. They might have a blocker, but we also have ways to invalidate those. And if you're swinging double attack banish 9k, they have to give up 3 cards to not lose 2. So either way, you are draining their resources. She's going to be especially useful versus stall matchups like Enel, and she can clinch certain games if this banish double attack goes through. As the Yamato player, you are able to tailor the timing of this Onami, as well as the power with which you swing, to the exact point where you want your opponent to give up the most resources. And the leader isn't the only good target for this effect either. Cracker, Hody Jones, Zoro, those are all huge threats with Banish. Sky Island was the most successful variant of Yamato, and Shura is going to get us to a lot of our curve and utility. We're not running the full Sky Island package. Gedatsu is pretty rare since, on the surface, he is counterintuitive to our leader's goal. But the cards that let us develop our board, get around blockers, and survive to the next turn are all here. Yamato usually wants to go first in order to be the aggressor, but with Shura we still have a great play going second. Hiyori has the same usefulness as she does in Enel, with a few more targets here. Some to get attackers out, some to heal, less emphasis on card advantage or shutting down our opponent's attacks. Beige, for instance, was played pretty rarely in Yamato lists. Less than half of the ones I was able to find, and most of them were pretty early on in the format when people were still figuring the leader out. Izo's going to be right at home here since he lets you rest a 4-cost character. You're shutting down so many blockers. You rest Rebecca, 4-cost Borsellino, Yonji, Sanji, Marco if you're playing against a Newgate. You just mow them down. He's not going to hit Sabo, Queen, or Momonosuke, but those won't be the only blockers in most decks, and at that point, you just attack into them. Up until now, Izo has had the drawback of no real long-term use in a game if you can't pick him back up, unless he's just that one last attack you need to go wide at the very end of the game. The great thing about Yamato, though, is that the secondary ability lets you turn Izo into a 5k attacker, so he can swing at life for basically free. The Ohm Holy combo is going to be one of your go-to 4 or 5 dome plays, alongside swinging for 7 or 8 and using Onami. If you just keep attaching Dome to your leader every turn, swing only with him, don't develop a board, you're very often going to run into a point where your opponent just manages to hold out at the very end and then revenge kill you. So a 2-for-1 character combo gives you more pressure and makes control decks use more pieces to out them. The best thing you can do while playing Yamato is weave in multiple, well-powered hits to maintain pressure and keep your opponent on their toes. However, we are running even more 4-dome characters at the max number of copies, like Kikunojo. I've gone into how good a card she is in the Enel video, but she's especially good here because you only need to hit your opponent's life once to get her effect live. So that situational caveat we see in other yellow decks is less of an issue in Yamato. On top of that, she's hitting for 8k with those rested Dome. You are getting the 2k counters out of your opponent's hand. If your opponent guards that first double attack, Ohm and Holy give you more bodies, and if they don't, Kikunojo gives you longevity. Charlotte Cracker is one of our best trigger attackers. If your opponent's at 3 life and you're lower than them, he is an 8k double attacker. That sounds pretty situational, but I feel like a lot of leaders need to really race Yamato to not lose, and the amount of life you have is not solely up to your opponent in this deck. And because of those reasons, he is an equally valid target for your Onami effect. Kozuki Momonosuke is the other big Wano card from set 6. 5-cost 6k is the exact stat line you want to have on a blocker. Even if Reject and Black Shenanigans can out him, Amaru, Izo, they aren't going to touch him. And on play, he lets you place one of your other Wano characters on the field into your life. This play isn't as common in Enel because your only targets will be Hiyori and Kiku, but with green, we can put Izo in there as well. All those cards are great to get back in your hand or trigger off life. The earlier builds also ran Neko Mamushi from set 6 to potentially come out of trigger and swing into your opponent's active blockers, so if you really like this direction, there are more ways you can tinker toward it. Nothing new to say about Satori, he's just generically good and searchable off of Shura, but Hody. Hody may not have been the most compelling antagonist, he may not be the one that we remember, but you're not going to forget about this card when you're playing against Yamato. Rush for green is a big development. and the ability to rest any 2 characters and or don't means your opponent always has to play around him. You give up 1 life to activate this effect, and that sounds like a drawback, but it can set your Amaro up, and to a lesser extent, Cracker. So it's really a perk. If you're putting everything into Hody, he can swing for 13k max, 14k if you use Amaro with him as well. So if you have full combo, if you're able to rest 3 of your opponent's characters, they're going to need 4 blockers for that lethal blow, and if they have those 4 blockers or 10k counter in their hand after all the hits we are giving them throughout this whole game, good for them. Good for them. They deserve the dub, if they have it. But real talk, playing him is a decision that you've got to weigh carefully. If he doesn't end the game, but you can survive through your opponent's turn, chances are he's going to close it on the crackback. But if you think your opponent might have that much defense, there are some other options you might want to consider. Our other finisher is the 9-cost Secret Rare Zoro from Set 6. He might be a little controversial here. He was in just over half of the lists analyzed for this. His inclusion in the CS winning list from December is going to be carrying a lot of that weight for him, but he's at least worth talking about. 9 cost, 9k. When he attacks, you can rest 1 and restand him. Then when you attack again, you can rest 2 more and then restand him again. So full power, he is swinging for 16k 3 times in a turn. Basically a power crept kid leader. If he swings after all the pressure your opponents put out, come on, they're not getting through that. He just has to get the chance to make those attacks. He doesn't have rush. I mean, thank God he doesn't have rush. That would be insane. But if you're up against a control deck and they haven't had to spend all their resources on your earlier bodies, they'll just get him off the board, and then you have wasted a really pivotal turn. So this is going to serve you best against matchups like Enel or Reiju, where you know he's going to stick on the board and likely be a checkmate. There's a chance he'll get to swing in those other matchups, but it's not quite as reliable, and there may be other cards you'd want to play instead. Your mileage may vary on him. I personally might wait a second to drop money on the copies. I've got other cards that are a bigger priority, but I've really enjoyed him in the testing before this video. You're the one who should disappear. Why is it always the 0-cost events that have the longest names? This card rounds out the deck's defensive capabilities. If you're in a matchup where Kikunojo or Zoro aren't going to be as useful, they're easy discards, but the main benefit this has is that it lets you keep swinging and deploying at max efficiency, rather than because of a distinct lack of no-counter cards. As you'll see here, we're running an average of 17 to 19 no-counters. Definitely not a low number, but definitely not as many as Enel or Sakazuki or even Katakuri. The trigger to heal a life without any cost is also great, but it's situational, and stacking that with Hiyori is going to be a little easier said than done. And Amaro is just such a wonderful card for all the reasons we mentioned in the Enel video, and it combos beautifully with Hody for a finish. And if you really want a turn 2 going first double attack to hit, you can play it on 3-Dome, swing 9k, and force them to either take it or discard 3. This is the one yellow deck that's not going to be playing Reject very often. We've already got so much aggression, we're going to get through our opponent's life, and since we're the aggressor, control really isn't as in theme for us, so at this point, it's probably just a win more card. Here we have those beautiful frequency stats. You'll see that unlike the other decks we've covered so far, the cards in the deck list aren't necessarily the ones that were played the most often. If I were constructing these lists like I did all the way back in Set 1, and just going with the most often played cards at their most played number of copies, we'd be seeing everything up through Mihawk and either Cracker, Satori, or Inuarashi. But since we're differentiating these decks based on the level of their achievement and their recency, the list the algorithm gives us is going to look a little bit different, especially in a deck as varied as Yamato. We've got some more Wano cards: Nekomamushi, Momonosuke to search, Inuarashi, Beige is a yellow staple. Mihawk actually works really well with the Holy Ohm combo. Really with any of these Slash characters, he's great for generating bodies. He would be the 51st through 54th cards in the deck if we had space. And here's that next tier of popularity and the potential tech cards that we have for this deck. Speaking once again to the way this algorithm works, you'll see that Holy and Ohm are in the final deck list, even though they were played less often across the board than Reject, Gedatsu, or Yamato. Normally, I'd be saying a couple words about each of them, giving my own thoughts on them, but this video's getting kind of long, and we've got another Yamato deck to go over. Most of these Yamato variants are going to lean very heavily on the yellow side of things, but Fortress Yamato is almost entirely green except for, his bestie Onami, with a very heavy Supernova and Don Quixote package. This deck still puts out pressure. You are getting your opponent down to 3 life as fast as you can. But it's also, of course, about defense. Bonnie and Baby 5 both search the pieces you need and draw your opponent's attacks away from your life. You're always going to want Kid and Rosinante as a combo, so tailor your opening hand and those searches to what's going to get you the cards you need. The set 4 Baby 5 as well as Scratch Manapoo are searchable 2k counters. Baby 5 could set you up for a free Punk Gibson play, but that's pretty occasional at best. Rosinante is perfect for Kid. Even if Black does some shenanigans to KO him, Rosinante can save him, and you get to keep that wall up. Killer is a cheap blocker you can play out the gate, and he is a welcome return from back in the OP01 days. Plus, you might be able to attach Stone to him with the leader ability and get that extra advantage for free. Izo is still our perfect androgynous boy, we love him, and Monet can stop your opponent from getting more swings in, or give you a better shot of pushing for lethal by resting a blocker. Sometimes she might even just dissuade your opponent from attacking on certain turns. We're still running 4 Hody. This deck is much more defensive, but he's just too good a finisher not to include. And the 8-cost Kid from way back in set 1 is, of course, the centerpiece of the deck. And the great thing is that you can get him going turn 4 going second. The minute you hit 8 Don by attaching to him with the leader ability, and that is an annoying wall to deal with 1 turn early. And after you set that magnetic wall up, maybe even 2 of them, your opponent's going to have to try and get through it if they want to get to your life. And if they try and get through your Kid, you just start freezing their attackers with that 10-cost Doflamingo. Very clear-cut strategy here. I haven't played many games with the Fortress build of Yamato. I wasn't even sure I was going to cover it until I started scripting everything and decided to separate them out. But the couple I've played were super fun. Definitely give it a try. I'm a big fan of this deck. The one thing I will say, though, is that Fortress Yamato did not see nearly the same amount of success as the other variants did. At least from what I was able to find on One Piece top decks and second storage. Again, they can't functionally get every single list in the meta, but if I'm only finding 4 lists, that does tell me it didn't make the biggest dent in the metagame. Another couple pages of stats for you. Bonnie, Rosinante, Izo, Kid, Apu, and Punk Gibson were played in all of these lists. Baby 5, Onami, Killer, Hody, Doflamingo, Baby 5, they were played in 3 of the 4. Whoever wins this war becomes Justice, and Monet got played half the time. But with this few lists to go off of, those are still enough to get them into the 50 for the video. Then finally we got some spicy techs here. Each of these were played in only 1 of the 4 lists. I love being able to do videos like these where I get to go into multiple builds of a leader. If I had the time to make content that I really wish I did, then exploring alternative builds would be one of my favorite things to do. And our number 3 deck is an old favorite all the way back from set 3, Katakuri. 3 yellow decks in a row, and this will be our final installment of the color. It took Katakuri a little bit of time to really pick up steam on OP06's release. And the starting environment was a perfect storm for him to fly under the radar. With Sakazuki being so dominant in OP05 and receiving more support in Set 6, anyone trying to counter it had to find ways to get multiple characters out in 1 turn, especially Gecko Moria, another new leader released in Set 6. And with the way Katakuri is built and tends to play, he can have a pretty hard time dealing with 5k after 5k after 5k. This new spread of go-wide strategies, especially Moria, brought Katakuri to the point that a fair amount of lists were cutting 10-mom down to 3, since there'd be a significant number of games that would end before she could even hit the board. At the same time, since he's such a generic leader with a strong ability, he's able to use the new tools that Yellow got in Set 6 just as well as the rest of them. Pudding will still be his go-to turn 1 play, but with all these new good Yellow cards that don't have Big Mom or Sky Island in a generically good leader, this runs the risk of her whiffing more often. But with 20 targets in the data list, we still have just shy of a 90% chance for hitting on the first turn, so our odds are still good. Onami can give us a good shot at banishing our opponent's life, or ripping some counter out of hand at the very least, especially if we don't have an on-curve play, or if we see something we really don't like on top of our opponent's life. But she's mainly here for the same reason she's in an L. She's a Thunderbolt trigger, and she has counter. Parasparrow ends up with the same situation that Pudding has, but there's an argument that can be made that he's here at this point because he comes out early game or off of trigger, rather than the effect itself. The Surge is still good, and it helps his case for being included, but it's not his main point, and we're not as worried about the Surge whiffing, or as easily willing to let him get KO'd. Capone Gang Beige is still Yellow's best trigger. You can put him right at the bottom with the leader effect, but he can still have value as a 2k counter if you draw him off your life at a time when the trigger won't help.
This is probably just confirmation bias, but I feel like there are so many games where I decide to take the first life and get over my initial habit of countering early. Like 80% of the time, it's a beige. It's just gonna be a beige. So at this point, don't necessarily do this. This might not be good. I'm not letting that first life in unless I see it. Unless I know it's not a trigger I need at the bottom. Amande is a searchable 2k counter that can discard a trigger to rest a 2 cost. 2 isn't the most relevant, but if you run into chump blockers in decks like Fortress Yamato or Perona, she could clear them for you. 4 cost blocker Sanji is making his first appearance in these videos. He did see play in Katakuri, but you're not going to be blocking with him as much as he used to because of all the shenanigans we have with Amaru or any black deck. But he comes out on trigger and swings for 5k, so at this point for Katakuri, the more attackers the better. If you've been watching so far, you know that Kikunojo's A+ in my book. Easily swinging 7k with our leader is going to make her effect live a little easier than it is in an L. Not quite as easy as Yamato, but it's not unreasonable to expect. A decent amount of lists did swap either her or Sanji out for Cracker as time went on in the format, especially as Yellow ended up gaining more presence as time went on. Gidatsu's our best shot against Kuzan in black, or to cut down on Moria's aggression since he can KO any of those Thriller Bar characters when life is at 4, and running both him and Kikunojo together gives you a couple options on turn 3 versus Sakazuki, depending on what they play. If you don't attack Sakazuki in the first couple turns, they might just play their 4-cost Borsalino to avoid the Gidatsu, and you can play the Kikunojo down to have a 6k swinger in, but there's a chance that they will either be able to Hound Blazer or KO her without the effect being active since they have the Borsalino to block your life swing. In fact, we're probably going to be seeing Kuzan played on 6 or 7 a lot more often now. But even if Gidatsu doesn't get to KO something, a 5-cost 6k is a great stat line right now, since it's a little tougher to get off the board, or at least makes these control decks use more resources to get him off the board that they won't have later on in the game. Satori is our usual staple for yellow. 5-cost 2k counter with 5k power on trigger is good. And here's the part that really took me for a loop. 4 7-cost Linlin. If you've seen the NL video, this might not surprise you. But 94.29, I've got to make sure I'm exact, got to be specific with the data, of these reported lists played her at 4, and the others only cut 1 copy. Of course, she will be best turn 4 when you can play her on curve, but a lot of the time, Katakuri is spending the early parts of the game swinging into life to try and close out fast, since he might not get to Tendon otherwise. So to that end, we're going to be going first more often than not. Some matchups might still want us to go second. And if you win that die roll, you can play 1 7-cost Linlin on 7 and another one on 9. If you're putting this pressure up, wearing them down, then they'll give you the life, and that might let you live long enough to get to those 10 mom chains. But if they trash that life, you are one step closer to the lethal combo. There's a good chance you've noticed that we don't have any of the 8-cost Katakuri in this deck, and he very much fell by the wayside during set 6. But since the English format is an extension of the Asian format, there's a chance that 1 or 2 copies could have merit for Fortress Yamato, or any of these black decks running the 8-cost Moria, and for the Mirror as well. And 10-cost Big Mom needs no introduction. Man, people really want to see her go, but she is still in the format. At least in Japan post April 1st. Who knows what's going to happen over here. Again, a fair amount did cut her down to 3, but that's not a her problem. Healing 1 and banishing 1 isn't suddenly bad, it's just the other decks sometimes make it so she can't be used as often. I've been running her at 4 in my testing, but cutting her down is something I want to experiment with. Maybe a copy of You're the One Who Should Disappear if you find yourself unhappy with the amount of counter or the amount of non-counter cards, but sky's the limit here. And then we get to the ultimate ungodly wombo combo of 200 million volts Amaru and Reject. I'll keep it relatively brief since I did discuss this in the Enel video. But if your opponent is relying on blockers to stay in the game, they might try to keep you at 2 life so that you can't use Amaru's effect when you're at 1 and rest one of their 4-cost characters. Reject solves this problem in the way that Thunderbolt has previously, by getting rid of 1 of your life, but instead of trashing that life, it goes to your hand, and instead of KOing one of your opponent's 5-cost characters at the same time, it can also do that. It shouldn't. That's just its second effect that you'd have to use in a different instance. But if your opponent is on their last life, that life goes to their hand. So you either KO the blockers that Amaru can't reach, but if you time it right, you facilitate Amaru in the first place and deal the last damage. As toxic or annoying, people will have different feelings on this, as this strategy is, it does open Katakuri up to a slightly more adaptable and opportunistic playstyle. He can diverge into one of two paths depending on the decisions your opponent makes and the individual circumstance of a given turn. But something I've had to learn is not to get too tunnel visioned on either avenue too much. Sometimes you might need to pivot from one to the other. Reject may or may not be banned during OP06 when it comes our way. We don't have details on that yet, but it's insane either way. And EV01's going to give us another way to draw from life, so we'll have a similar, slightly less powerful, but similar strategy to work with as time goes on. And what do you know? It is frequency and card count time, and I swear this was an accident. This was not intentional. This is just the cards we put in the algorithm list, but we got a nice baker's dozen over here. I sincerely apologize to anyone who doesn't actually watch or read One Piece and has no idea why I'm mentioning donuts so much here. But I'm also jealous of you because you get to read Whole Cake for the first time. Beige is always around 100%. No surprise there. 7-cost Linlen is astoundingly popular, as we talked about. Tenmon played by everybody. 57.14% at 4 copies, the other 42.86% at 3. Then Pudding and Perospero were a little less popular than the Gidatsu and Amaru. Reject, Onami, Sanji, Satori, and Amande were all over 75%, or just around there in Amande's case. And Kikunojo was a bit polarizing, a little under 50%, but I think it's just the high-achieving lists having her that pushed her through the algorithm. Then we have our potential inclusions, Charlotte Cracker if you want to change up the 4 costs, the Katakuri Secret Rare. I haven't tested it in OP06, but I do plan to. You're the One Who Should Disappear, gives us a little more defense, gets rid of those counterless cards. Thunderbolt, some people wanted a mix of that and Reject, and also to have her on trigger. I think we're fine with Onami. Strusen's another 2K option. He'll probably end up seeing more play if Sakazuki gets banned before set 7 and we get stuff like Law back or Zoro, or even if Zoro has a surprise weekend like he did in set 5 over here. Hiyori's nice, but might not be the most necessary given all the trigger shenanigans we have with our leader ability. Brûlé blocks, and we'll finally get this 4-cost Zoro promo that Japan's had since set 5, but I think he's already been power crept, honestly. Shirahoshi's a nice utility card, but at this point we are focused on establishing bodies with our triggers. And this one's pretty interesting. The Edward Newgate from Star Deck 13, which we'll be getting, I think, a month into the format. He's a 6-drop 7k. On play, you can add the top card of your deck to the top of your life cards, then look at all of your life cards, place one on top of your deck, and return the remaining life in any desired order. He does fill out our curve if we're going second. 7,000's a great number to hit naturally. And it's pretty cool that we can essentially roadmap our life, start focusing on avoiding our opponent's triggers as time goes on, or still do some rearranging of our own life if the game starts going in a different direction than we anticipated. El Thor's the Yellow Radical Beam. Probably be live pretty often with all the aggression we try and put out, but we really want to use our Doan for that aggression. Then Omen Holy, they are extra bodies. No trigger though, and we're not really running Shura to search either of them out. And every now and then we saw the 7 drop in now. I think he could be kinda cheeky, kinda cool if you're not drinking the 4 copies of 7 Linlen Kool-Aid. But that 95%, that's looking pretty good. I don't think I'm gonna mess with that. With the nature of yellow being the trigger color, and the way that Katakuri has built himself over time, this deck has a reputation as a high-rolly, brain-dead, trigger-happy, just curve-out sort of deck, which I've always taken a teeny bit of issue with. I'm not saying that it's completely misinformed, I just think it's a little more nuanced than that. But as time went on in the Asian format, players did realize that it was going to take more skill to succeed with Katakuri than it would have before. It's really important to see the pathway to your checkmate scenario. Know if you need to starve your opponent or put the aggression out. The mulligan is more important and more subtle. And even though we're focusing very highly on the triggers, the question of whether we should be pulling a trigger off in the moment or letting it go to our hand is also a very big question. Of course, lots of these were already factors to playing Katakuri well in the first place, but mistakes on any of these fronts are much more punishing in set 6 than they had been before. Katakuri is one of those decks that has a decent track record standing up to Sakazuki, and as Sakazuki got more popular in the Asian format, Katakuri followed suit to match it. He's going to be around for a long time because this ability is just so generic and so good. And the thing I really love about this list that the data gave me, and as I'm sure anyone who has the deck from last format will agree with, this is going to be pretty cheap to upgrade. We don't need Hiyori or Momonosuke. Those Wano super rares don't have to be in here. Out of any deck I'm talking about in these videos, when it comes to just the new cards from set 6, this is the cheapest one by a mile, and it's still powerful. For those reasons, and because I just think the deck is fun, and there's more room to learn with it than there ever was before, I'm going to, for at least a little while, be maining Katakuri in set 6. Wait, no, I'm recording. And now for our number 2 deck. This is a leader that I was very excited about as soon as it got announced for OP06, Gecko Moria. The recursion mechanic that broke Black open for Sakazuki last format gets its next step with Moria's ability to attach 1, attack and tap 2, then discard 1, mill 2 from the top of the deck, and resurrect a 4-cost or less Thriller Bark character, giving you a wide board, and turns the discard into what's essentially a second hand with some other recursion cards we play. Being a black deck, Moria definitely has some nice control pieces, but the main draw of the deck is to create, widen, and maintain a resource difference due to a combination of pressure, control, and recursion. Looking through Japanese articles and playing the deck myself has given me a new appreciation for it, far beyond my first impression. Moria just has a really wonderful blend of aggression, combo, and control to really tailor itself to different kinds of skill expression in a particular game or meta. 5 life is also great in a format like this, and especially for a deck that's so resource-oriented. Lots of lists at the start of the Asian format started by focusing mostly on the Thriller Bark engine, with a couple generically good black cards splashed in here and there, and over time more and more Navy focus came in until it was just as prevalent as the Thriller Bark characters. Since the trash is our big resource, having plays for our leader effect is going to require some setup, and Victorious Sindri lets us bin 5 on play, usually on our first turn going first. After that, she's a 2k, but you could potentially play her again and reuse this effect through a couple different means if you need certain combo pieces. Or she might be that last poke you need for lethal. Tsuru is generically good in here, just like in Perona. You'll be using the reduction a little more, but we also have great eruption for that, and a 2k counter is great defense. Helmeppo's been out for a while, but he just started seeing play in set 6. He's sort of a 5th and 6th Tsuru, but he's specifically good to deal with 5 cost or any odd cost characters more efficiently, usually alongside Absalom, or played in tandem with Lucci off the 8 cost Moria. Branu is the other discard fueler if we end up going second. If he shows up after turn 1, he's easily binned for counter, but you can also bring him back with Moria. The other great thing about this deck is that it's going to have plays going first or second in just about any matchup. There will be a preferred choice if you win the die roll, but you often won't be too mad about the result if you don't get it. Hina's -4 cost is stellar, as anyone playing in set 5 knows. And the fact that she's natively a 5k swinger works incredibly well with Moria's MO of poking the opponent for resources. And she's quite useful when she's played from hand, more so than she's in Sokka. And I'll go into a couple examples of that use soon. The 2 copies have put in work so far, but as I start tinkering beyond this list, I want to experiment with more copies of her or the 4-cost Kuzan, which did see more play in the last month of the format, but just didn't break into the algorithm overall. Especially since he replaces himself and requires a response from the opponent. At this point, I feel like the main candidates to either cut or shave copies of for them would be... the algorithm says Branu, surprisingly, a copy of Ice Age, maybe Rebecca if we're going the Kuzan route, maybe a Lucci, maybe a Borsellino, and maybe 1 or 2 Sabo. Even though we don't run him at a full 4, Borsellino is still a staple, especially at yellow. Even if they can Amaro him, it still gets us around a Gidatsu early game. 3 feels good with everything else we're fitting in. Sometimes he's even a 2 of, depending on how much Sakazuki or yellow you end up seeing, but he's worth playing at some count in this deck at least. Rebecca sometimes got called the zombie card in set 5, and that fits pretty nicely here. You can pick up a 2k or do some Hina shenanigans just like in Sakazuki, and a great play at 7 Don is to bring back Hina in conjunction with Absalom. I hate the character, but I love this card. Oftentimes, he will be a crucial combo piece and one of the main cards you want to see in your discard. Remember, Moria's effect lets you play him for 3 Don even though it says 4 in the corner. On play, you send 2 cards from your trash to the bottom of your deck and KO a 2 cost. Adding a Great Eruption or Suru brings that up to 4 cost, or on 7 Don, you can play Rebecca, get the Hina back, and play him with the leader ability to KO a 6 cost. Or if you go second, you can hard play the Hina from hand and still do the Absalom that same turn. He is an efficient and consistent way to let you keep your opponent's board at bay, but blasting it away like Sakazuki does isn't necessarily our priority. He's also huge for dealing with our opponent's 8-cost Moria in the mirror if we combine him with a Rebecca into a Hina and a Great Eruption or a Suru, or he can KO a 7-Mom with Ice Age. Lucci's still good because he hits 2 targets, but Absalom essentially costs 3, requires you to spend less of your discard, and he's recurable, so he's going to be the main control option here. If you can generate enough advantage by staving off your opponent's smaller and mid-sized characters, you might be able to get enough of a lead or the resources you need to not even be wary of the big characters later on. Perona's a go-to 3-Doan play since she rips a card out of the opponent's hand if they already have 5 or more, which they almost always will on your second turn going first. When you're against Sakazuki, you love being able to use her multiple times, and she's no slouch early game against yellow. She can also reduce the cost of a character by 3, but we have lots of other pieces for that, so using her as a 2k counter, which is just as important as the hand rip, and depleting our opponent's resources are her main functions. Hogback is, in a sense, the weakest of the 3 Thriller Bark 4-drops, at least as far as effects with immediate significant repercussions. And there was one list that brought him down to 3, but in my opinion, the resources he gets you are too useful not to play it for. Early game, he's a backup for Perona or Absalom to get the most out of your leader ability, but the best thing about him is that he can get any Thriller Bark character back. Not just the 4-cost or below, meaning that you want to mill your 8-cost Moria off the deck, because Hogback can just retrieve him right after. And then late game, he can get Perona or Sindri back in hand to shore up your defense, and then keep that resource disparity in your favor. We've got 3 Lucci here. He's still amazing, but a chunk of lists even ended up playing him at 2. And he's best played off the 8-cost Moria alongside Helmeppo to KO a 5-cost and a 1-cost, or a 4-cost and a 2-cost, more if you add a Great Eruption or an Ice Age to that. This deck is much better at processing singular threats than multiple, but a couple copies gives you wiggle room, especially as the Mirror or other matchups might try to cheat out multiple bodies to get around the control aspects, just as long as you don't tunnel vision on it. In the Mirror, you're going to want to check your opponent's trash for this before you play your Moria, since it's going to affect their response and therefore your optimal play. I believe that Sabo fits Moria better than any other leader. Cycling 2 directly benefits our use of the trash as a resource, and in games when you're focusing on a wide board and resources, especially versus other black decks, he makes it harder to lose out on the board state. He's a great play on curve, or on 9 with Rebecca if you need defense, or feel secure enough in your board to not play Moria down immediately. He's also great against yellow, as we discussed in Perona, since Amaru can't hit him. Reject can still hurt, but he's a more reliable blocker in that sense than the 4-costs, and in that way he makes it harder for yellow to get the Reject lethal combo. And here's the Gecko Mori man. God, what a stupid card. With all the milling and the inclusion of Hogback, he is so easy to find in this deck, even if we don't have a traditional searcher, and there are so many options we can play off of him. Synergistic go-tos are Helmeppo and Lucci, Hogback and Branu. Your opponent is always going to have to plan for what he resurrects and how they'll deal with him, and chaining him just keeps the advantage going even harder. I think that the Mirror is honestly very fun to play or just watch because the 8-cost Moria head-to-head and how both sides have to react to or choose whether to play him themselves or save him is just so interesting and everything I love about this game. Great Eruption is going to get us some better reach for our KOs and replace our resources. I am very curious to see how this deck is going to fare without it if we get the bans during set 6. But I think we do have ways to fill these slots, either with substitutions like Soap Sheep, for example, people have been throwing that one around, or more utility that we already use. But it just makes things go so smooth here. And Ice Age is our main way to deal with those high-cost characters if we need to. If you're at Tendone and you have this, Moria, and either Great Eruption or Sura in your hand, you can KO a 9-cost with Absalom or Lucci. But that being said, it definitely wasn't a mandatory 4-of, especially as time went on. With the number of directions this deck can go and needs to go in a lot of situations, its use and the number of slots it's worth can vary a lot. And now it's stat time. As we'll see, the Thriller Bark Mysterious 4 are almost always played. The only time we didn't see one of them was this one very interesting list that didn't play any Absalom. They didn't even replace it with extra Lucci. Lucci was actually a 2. They were running Inupe, Cerberus, for Helmeppo, even though they had less removal options. It was very, very interesting. I might play some games with it, just to see how it runs without him. Everything else we have in this list is played at a majority, with a lot of them over 80%. The only very popular card that didn't make it in was Cerberus. He saw a fair amount of play at the very beginning, he is consistent off of our leader ability, he can be played off of the 8-cost Moria, But as people realize that low-cost blockers are just less and less effective, the more we see Sakazuki, Yellow, and Yamato, and as the Navy package started making its way into the deck even more, Cerberus ended up being one of the first cuts to make. And we only have a couple cards to mention for these potential substitutions. There were more cards than this that ended up seeing play in certain Moria decks that got reported, but all of them were at under 7% usage, 4 lists out of all of these at the max, and a lot of them were weighted toward that very early part of the format when people were still figuring the deck out. I like Tashigi if we want another 2k, she's searchable off Navy, and we can do some early game shenanigans if we don't see our Thriller Bark characters, like I've mentioned in other videos. But if we don't see our Thriller Bark characters, we're probably not having a good time anyway. Kuzan, his inclusion at the end was just so new that it didn't make it into these 50. But I really, really want to find space for him in this list because it feeds so well into this resource game we're playing. Lola can be played off of Moria, but at a certain point we don't have enough space and she is not doing anything proactive, especially when this deck swings for 5k so much. The 6 is just icing on the cake that we might not need. One-Legged Soldier is an alternative to Helmeppo. He can be brought back by Moria to reduce a character's cost by 3. Only issue is that he is not searchable with Branu, he is Dressrosa, and if you're trying to go wide for one last lethal swing, he's going to be hard to facilitate that with. And then Kobe, our wonderful boy, salute him, one of my favorite characters in the whole series, but sadly he makes us discard, and the way this deck is running, that's probably going to be more harm than help. There are some other cool lists. There was a version that played the Thriller Bark stage, went very hard with Inupe. Some tried Shadows Asgard. Let me see how many. 2 lists at the very beginning played Shadows Asgard, and that was getting pretty hyped up when this leader was first revealed. Some tried the Negative Hollow in order to get more hand rip in there. I think there are some very fun ways that you can build Moria, but if we are competitive, if we're trying to get the best matchups, this Navy engine is going to be our best bet. I am done making promises as far as when I will upload content next after a current project, because I just never know what my life is going to look like aside from set releases. But if you are interested in seeing coverage on some of these Thriller Bark-centric lists, I can at least try. I can aspire to do so, and maybe I'll end up on Sim one night and record some games. Maybe. Hard, maybe. But if you want that, please let me know. If it wasn't apparent from the way I've been talking about this deck, I am just so fascinated with Moria, and I really want to play it more after I finish these videos. The fact that it feels like this, honestly, silly in the best way middle ground between Zoro and Sakazuki, and just jumps between playstyles over the course of one game feels so cool to me and so interestingly designed. I can't promise that it has an amazing Sakazuki matchup as it is most often built, but since I started recording these videos, I actually looked at some of these limitless tourneys that were run online. Small sample size, but those players have done pretty well against Sakazuki. But at the time of this recording, those players are at a 14-8 record against Sakazuki. Small sample size, again, but very interesting. And this could be one of the ways that our meta ends up evolving from Japan's, but as far as Japan's went, he was very firmly number 2. I will say that he did start the format very firmly at number 1 up until, I want to say, just before or just after Star Deck 14 came out, and as people figured out that Sakazuki was still good, and then take advantage of a very opportunistic moment to regain and then hold his former position. Sakazuki is just going to control the board better than we do, but by honing in on the other tricks that this deck has, and tailoring the list we play to the matchups we expect the most, or need to cover ourselves against, it has the potential to 50-50 almost anything you see. I am very confident when I say that. And that has its own appeal, especially if you don't want to deal with the rock, paper, scissors aspect of metagaming a tourney, or if you want your games to be decided by as little variance as possible. Of course, it's still a trading card game. If we didn't want any variance, we'd be playing chess, but you get the drift of what I'm saying. As of this moment, Moria hasn't really been doing much in Set 7. The Black Lucci leader and Sakazuki have managed to overshadow him, and the loss of Great Eruption does still worry me to a degree. But this deck is just so cool, and if you're planning to get the new black cards from the set anyway, you've got to build this and try it. 6 decks down, 1 to go. No idea what it could be. If I didn't already have the stats, this would be just a mystery. I would be I would be foaming at the mouth just to try and get some idea of what the final deck could be. But that's a question. That's a mystery. That is a mystery that we will solve in just a second. Reiju Perona, Enel, Yamato, Katakuri, Moria, and number 1. Oh man, I really want to troll here. No, don't say it's Iceberg. Don't say it's Newgate. Oh man, I want to say it's Queen. I wish it was Queen, but it is Sakazuki. So, getting right into it, I'm sure that no one is surprised. I certainly am not. The text on the leader is just too good. Consistency and control utility on one leader, where you can use both effects each turn, can't not be good. Of course, Bandai finally realized that, and the Eastern player base won't be able to play it come April. No idea how much longer we'll have him. We could see a ban in April, we could see a ban when Set 7 hits. But he'll definitely be live for at least a bit of Set 6, and I'm guessing most, if not all, of the formats, so I'm going to present this with that possibility in mind. Even beyond the consistency and the different types of removal he has, Sakazuki just makes blues removal, which was just balanced enough to not be completely overpowered, too efficient to compete against, just because that extra -1 cost is free. It's very fun to drag him, to naysay him, it's fun to meme, but I haven't been as dissatisfied with his reign as I was with Red, since he's a bit more skill-based, especially in the mirrors. But the fact that he shuts so many decks out of the format completely makes me fine with him going, even if I would have preferred an errata that didn't completely kneecap him. But we take the dubs where we can. The deck's general concept to control the board as much as possible and to protect life with blockers and just enough counter to survive stays the same, but these new cards in Set 6 give him more power and versatility. Search options for black, particularly the navy, have been limited with cards like Branu, but Set 6 gives us a 1-cost top 5 navy searcher in Tashigi, and she is not color limited. Seeing 5 makes us even more consistent than we were before, and between her and Branu, we can just play a bunch of weenies in the early game and potentially get 3 5k swings on turn 3 with a Houndblaze. Suru's still at home here, but there is a teeny shift in how to prioritize 2ks now. Before, she was always the one you'd save because she was the more efficient reducer compared to the 3-cost Tashigi, and not recurable off of Rebecca. But now you want to get that first Suru in the discard before Adon, so you have the option to resurrect her with Moria. And that could be by using her as a 2k counter, or playing her to the field, getting your board up to 5 characters, and then sending her to the discard with your next one, potentially even that 8-cost Moria. More discard use makes Branu more useful because, he was just dead weight before. He's still playable off of Rebecca, and now off of Moria, but late game Tashigi is going to give you a wider search if you have the option to play her off Moria instead. The algorithm gave us 1 copy of Helmeppo. 2 was a pretty common count though, which I grew to enjoy. He's a nice middle ground between Suru and Hina. It sort of acts like a 5th copy of both of them in this list, while also easing some of our math. I might futz around with a 2nd copy depending on how I feel about the amount of counter, certain matchups, and where the potential cuts might come in. The 3-cost Hina swings for 5,000 and reduces a character's cost by 4 on play. This is one of the cards that broke him in Set 5. People were playing Rebecca before the list we've all come to know and accept came into being. But even beyond your standard Rebecca-Hina-Lucci combo, or now your Moria-Rebecca-Hina, there's options. We'll get into those. She's useful as a hard play sometimes as well. 4 copies of 4-cost Porcelino is what the data told me, and it's pretty nice for Moria or for the mirror, but cutting 1 for a Sabo is also a very valid option for yellow reasons. The Sabo could still get rejected, but then it's a life that they don't get to burn. Rebecca and Lucci still enable some very degenerate 2-body removal, and Rebecca Hina Lucci is still a pretty good play. But the 8-cost Moria lets us play either of them from the trash, depending on if we want to recover resources or get multiple KOs, while still getting a huge body out. The 3-cost Tashigi that was common in Set 5 has been replaced by Virgo. Not necessarily because of his in-battle stickiness, but because until EBO1, he's the only 2k that can be searched by Branu and Tashigi, and recurred by Rebecca. And with decks like Yamato in the format, having easier access to our 2ks is more important than ever. The 7-cost Porcelino is a bit overshadowed by Moria, but he might be the best play turn 4 going first, since he tucks a 5 cost with the ability, and the mirror can only remove him with Rebecca Hina Lucci, rather than playing their own Moria. At which point the player going first can clear 2 of them with their own Moria, or hoard more resources. And speaking of Moria, what can I say about him that I haven't already? Just that he opens up even sillier multi-removal plays here than he does elsewhere, with the same walling and resource capabilities, but I'm going to get to the math of it in a second. Great Eruption is still a dummy good card, and playing it on 9 Don with Moria lets you Lucci KO any 2 characters whose costs add up to 9 with the addition of Helmeppo. But if you see multiple at the start, you could definitely burn one to get closer to your combo pieces. Ice Age really lets us go tall with our removal, but until Great Eruption is banned, we really only need 2. At least we would if Sakazuki would still be a leader. Playing this on 9 with the Moria Lucci Helmeppo combo lets you then KO the opponent's Moria and a 4 cost or any combo adding up to 12. Adding a Great Eruption or Tsuru on top of that gets you up to 14 cost removed in total. And if you play both Ice Age, you can get a 10 cost and a 7 cost, or a 9 cost and an 8 cost, and anything below that. Granted, it is very unlikely you will need or have the exact pieces to do so, but just the fact that it is possible in itself is astounding. Actually, wait, let's have a little fun with this. If we really want to imagine the absolute ceiling of removal we have here, we could either go -1 to something with the leader, -4 to something with the Hina, we've paid 3 at this point, both Ice Age, another -5, another -5, that's 2 more Dome we've paid for 5 in total, and a Great Eruption or Tsuru, so that's another 1 Dome we've used before the Lucci, or the Ice Age and 3 Great Eruption or Tsuru with 2 Dome left over to KO 2 10 costs. Again, no reason for this at all. That's if you're facing down 2 10 moms, that's just, I don't know what to tell you at that point, but the possibility of it. Anyway, Houndblaze added to the list of cards that broke this deck wide open in set 5 and still pulls its weight here, with more pesky on KO effects such as Kikunojo or Ryuma, and Sabo giving KO resistance in Black Mirrors. Do not be caught without it. And the last new card we have is Ama no Murakumo, a 2-cost event that tucks a 2 cost and a 1 cost. It's a Lucci effect on a 2-cost event without a trash requirement. Yeah, no, you don't get a body, but the efficiency and the tucking are nutso. I really like this one at 2, especially against yellow with all of its trigger bodies, but the algorithm decided to give us 1. In my testing with this deck, and I'm ashamed to say how much fun doing this was, but my favorite play was to go Moria into Rebecca to bring back a Hina and a Helmeppo to then tuck any 2 characters who add up to 11. So if you're in a Black Mirror, you're tucking the Moria and the Hina that they have on board, and you get set up a blocker. How many times can I call a card stupid? This is stupid, at least for the time it has a home in Sakazuki. Then, who knows if we're ever going to see this again. Whew, man, all of this... all this rage in my heart toward this deck, even though I find it really fun to play because I'm just a toxic control player, just makes me need to relax, and I think some stats will help us do that. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is the most centralized we've seen any of these decks' card pools, at least as far as whether these cards are included or not. The fact that we are 12 cards in before we get to something that is played in less than 90% of these decks really tells us just how strong and how reliable this whole engine is. I do very much want to find more room for a second Murakumo or a second Helmeppo. Looking at this, it's really hard to find something to get rid of. Part of me wants to say bring down Borsellino to 3, but I already want that to be a Sabo. It's so strong, but it's also such a delicate machine, you know? What was that? This needs to get banned right now. I can't be talking like that. I think an earlier iteration of the algorithm, before I brought the post-Star Deck 13 stuff, actually had Helmeppo only at 1, and I think that Helmeppo was the second Murakumo, so take that for what you may. And just a few elective cards here. Toshigi, still a great card. Definitely not worth replacing our Virgos or our Tsurus because she's just less searchable, but if you want more 2Ks, she's the best option you have. I've talked about Sabo. I like the idea of Sabo. I like the idea of one Sabo in particular. That's going to be working his way in. Kuzan's very in theme, but the space is already so tight and there are already so many cards that do similar things to him, including our leader ability. Pudding did see some play here, just like she did in Reiju. It's very cheeky, it's very, very rude of this Sakazuki, of this Admiral, to enlist this sweet girl who has never betrayed anyone or done anything wrong in her life into his evil, evil schemes. But I like the idea of putting in Sakazuki, especially off Moria. It's just, oh no, putting off Moria, that's so degenerate. 3000 Worlds is one of my favorite cards as a Blue Croc stan, but it's going to be a hard sell given the amount of other great cards we have for Fordone and the fact that it doesn't give us a body to distract our opponent from our life. Barto's very cool, but blockers are a bit precarious here. He's, I could see some argument for him as a 9th 2k counter if you can find the space. And Jion could work in the mirror against Nami, any of these event-heavy decks. I think she's pretty cool. Sakazuki just got so much more power in a very small addition to its card pool. But the power creep for the other colors do require the pilot to really think about what they'll need for their ideal play turns in advance, and know whether they should focus on removal or defense at any given moment. And one wrong discard off the leader effect is going to be all the more brutal. All joking, seething, coping aside, well, maybe not coping aside, let me know if you think this is cope. Basically, I've gone on about the ceiling of this deck's combos, but you'll still only have so many pieces to work with in a game. So you'll probably need to pick one turn to pause your removal and focus on tempo or defense so that you can last through the game and make the most of these insane late game plays we've been talking about. These may come down to a battle of 8 Morias, but I think that the mirrors are going to be even more interesting in Set 6, so Sokka will at least go out in a blaze of something, glory, volcanoes, justice. No, not justice. This is not justice. That new leader is so bad. That's not justice. Anyway, enjoy OP Format Part 2. Insert NCIS, CSI, whatever procedural show theme here, and let's see what pops up with the bands when they come our way. Now, before we finish up and I say goodbye for however long it takes me to put more content on this channel, hopefully not as long as it normally is, I just want to give even more context to these rankings by going through the progression of the format as it happened in the East. When Set 6 came out, we seemed to have a Sakazuki, Moria, Yamato triangle, with Sakazuki pulling a bit ahead out the gate, but Yamato ended up taking a dive once people figured out how to play against him, and Moria ended up dominating for a while. At least until the week before Star Deck 13 came out, and at that time, Reiju actually had her very successful weekend. Soon after the release of Star Deck 13, Sakazuki began really ramping up its results and had its first stint in the Super Tier 0 spot, and Perona came onto the scene with her CS win. After that, Sakazuki and Moria battled each other for the top spot, and people realized how good Katakuri could still be in this meta, which then pushed things into a period where Katakuri and Sakazuki were pretty even, with Yamato and Moria battling below them, and Moria ended up pulling ahead for a moment, but eventually Sakazuki emerged at the very top with almost 50% of the achievement share in the week before EPO1, and that was a height slightly beyond his best point in Set 5. We didn't take any results from EBO1 into account when it came to these rankings or the deck lists, but I'll say that EBO1 gave us a couple shakeups. Mainly some success for Red Purple Law, which ended up in Tier 1, and then a few wins for Green Uta, ended up in Tier 2, and then some other cool, silly things, but Sokka was still just far above everything else the entire time. Hopefully I can get a little deeper into EBO1 as we get closer to that release, but that's where the analysis will end for now. Now, in my notes, I said that we have no idea when we'll get the bans or if they'll be the same ones as Japan, but like a couple hours after I uploaded the Sakazuki video, Bandai announced that we are getting the same bans as the Eastern format starting on June 21st. So that means we are going to have Sakazuki this entire time at full power. Yellow will still have impact. Black in general will still have Great Eruption. And I had speculated a bit on this, thought about what it could do to the OP06 format as a whole. Basically, Impact being banned actually helps Moria as long as they can fill in the space left by Great Eruption, which I think there is a chance that they can. And decks like Red Green Law, Purple Luffy, Green Uta could have a chance to break into the format with Sakazuki gone, maybe Red Purple Law as well, and I was going to say that maybe Red could be a color again. But I'm not sure how relevant that's going to really be now that we know when the bans are coming and the fact that it won't be during this set. But there is something that's kind of funny about this, because I ended up looking at the unofficial online tournaments in the Set 6 format that have been done through Limitless TCG, and of those 9 tournaments, Sakazuki was the most played deck in only 2 of them. Yamato was the most played the most often at 5 of those 9. And if I look at anything that's gone on in the past week, as of the day of this recording, let's see. 15 Moria decks, 14 Katakuri, 14 Yamato, 11 Sakazuki, 10 Reiju, 4 Purple Luffy, 3 Perona, 3 Red Purple Law, 2 Enel, 2 Newgate, and 1 each of Nami and Bello Betty. With a couple people even earlier trying Zoro and Green Uta. Interesting. And then I ended up going into the matchup rates that I could determine from those tournaments. I'm not going to put the numbers up here just because it is a small sample size, and because I think it's being affected by people not knowing when the bans would hit. Time will tell, probably within this next week or so, if I am proven wrong, but I figured that if people thought there was a chance Sakazuki could get banned during Set 6, which seemed to be a pretty common opinion from my circles that I've talked to, they're not going to be practicing him in Set 6, they're going to see what's next. And then anyone still on Sakazuki is going to be a much smaller portion than it normally would be. And I think the skill level is going to be much more polarized. You'll either have someone who is really, really good at it and is committed to it, or someone who just might not know how to play these new matchups yet, and then ends up struggling a bit. What I will say is that as far as achievement goes, Moria, Yamato, Katakuri, those are the 3 that have gotten the best placement so far. And then Reiju's win percentages are just insane. This might just be a couple people who are really, really good with Reiju rather than an average expected performance, which I think speaks to what I was saying in that portion of the video as well. She is, in the right hands, scary, and I love her for that. But as far as the data we've been working with so far, and what determined the rankings you have seen in this video, I'm just going to come back to our tier list real quick, and you will see that Perona and Reiju are in Tier 3, Yamato and Enel are in Tier 2, Moria and Katakuri are in Tier 1, pretty much tied with each other, due to their different periods of highest achievement in the format. And Sakazuki is in Tier 0. Woohoo! To present this in another way, here is that pie chart you've been seeing between each entry, with the point values and percentages accompanying them. This is what I have been working off when I've tried to get an expectation for the metagame, but I can definitely see this deviating. For example, Sakazuki usually had at least a 30% share of any regional in OP05, and I could see a world where that gets larger in Set 6. But at the same time, I could see people stepping away from him because they're not going to get to play with him anymore soon. Enel is currently doing really well in Set 7, so people might jump to him, but then again, we're going to lose Impact, and so are they, so we still really don't know what's going to be best in that set either. And I think that where Sakazuki ends up is going to have an impact that spreads out toward the rest of the format, and the same can be said of Yellow as a whole and of Moria as their own origin points in these sort of ripples that spread out throughout the meta. Because these decks are not going to end up staying the same, but it's a little different than having a full leader band. And Moria is also super new, so people are already looking to chef with him. As far as what I'm going to play with, Katakuri is currently my pick because I just need to spend $20 to get those new singles. He is still strong. I'm going to use Impact as often as I can, but I'm definitely hoping to win some store credits so I can pick up these black singles from Moria and the whole German package to play Reiju. Still think that she has a chance against just about anything. But I hope this video has helped you figure out what you want to play in Set 6. Or that you're just like me and want to play everything because the set's just going to be so fun and there's so much exciting stuff to play. If you've made it through this entire video, thank you so much. The watch time means more than you could ever know. As do comments of support. I've gotten some people saying some really, really nice things about the content, and that really makes me want to do this more often. I plan to respond to everyone who's had something to say pretty soon over this weekend. Even if you just watched the start and the end of this video, or just took screenshots of the list, I still appreciate you stopping by. If you have enjoyed the countdown or this big ol' smorgasbord video, feel free to leave a like. As always, I love hearing what you have to say in the comments. And if you would like to know as soon as I get more content out there, be it for EBO1, OP07, or just some cool stuff that we see winning over the course of Set 6, then go ahead and click that subscribe button. This is Sakura Kingdom. I am going to take a nap. Well, I've got to get some work done for other stuff, but after that, I'm taking a fat nap. Well, I also might go on the ranked sim finally and play some category. But then I'm taking a nap. Appreciate y'all. Thank you so much. Have a great day and enjoy set 6.